All right, so this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. We've got chapter 17, Transformations in Europe, 1500 to 1750. We'll be looking at section 1, Culture and Ideas. So this chapter, specifically 17, is dedicated to Europe. Recall that in chapter 16, really the major event which took place was the discovery of the New World and all the consequences that the discovery of the New World had, including the increased amount of wealth that went specifically to Europe. It was initially Spain in the West, which colonized the Americas, but also Portugal, which didn't technically claim many New World territories. The Portuguese did claim Brazil, but the Portuguese were especially active in the Indian Ocean and really were able to take advantage of that Indian Ocean trade and brought in a lot of wealth. So between this period, 1500 to 1750, a lot of wealth is pouring into Europe, and that has some changes, or it causes some changes and transformations on the European continent. Now, not all the transformations or changes are related to the discovery of the New World, but they all kind of tie together in a lot of ways. This section, we're looking only at culture and ideas. If you're not entirely familiar, culture is things like beliefs, attitudes, expectations. Culture you can't really put your finger on, really, but it is the combination of the attitudes, beliefs, values, morals, ideas can also be added into culture. And a good proxy for culture most of the time, especially when studying history, is that of religion. So when you think of culture and studying cultures, think religions. Religion has a big part to play in it. It's not the only thing that contributes to cultures, but again, things like beliefs and ideas are heavily tied there. So in Europe, there's a massive religious transformation which takes place between the years 1500 and 1750. The major change which takes place is an event known as the Protestant Reformation, right? The Protestant Reformation. But before we get to that, right, again, we'll call this a major change, the Protestant Reformation. Before we get to that, let's give a little bit of background about the history of religion in Europe. So Europe was predominantly a Christian continent. And in fact, despite the fact that you had a lot of different empires and kingdoms and princes, one thing that united more or less all of Europe was religion. It was Christianity. That dated back to the time periods of the Romans, which spread Christianity. In terms of time period, we're talking about roughly 500, the year 500. However, though, there was a split within Christianity, and this occurred approximately 1100 CE. So still 400 years before where our chapter begins. In the year 1100, an event known as the Great Schism divided Christianity into two groups. You had just what we might call, what we're going to call Roman Christianity and Orthodox. Running a little bit out of room here. But that was the split that occurred in 1100. Orthodox Christianity was what's practiced in places like Russia, the Balkans. What really separates Orthodox Christianity from Roman Christianity is where one's allegiance is to. Roman Christianity, or Roman Catholicism, as it'll be known, understands the papacy or the Pope, right? So the papacy or the Pope is the leader of the Catholic Church, right? Leader of the Catholic Church. So Roman Christianity, Roman Catholicism, it's the same group, right? Same group as compared to Orthodox Christianity, which is mostly practiced in Russia and the Balkans. Here you have, of course, the center of Roman Christianity being Rome, Italy, but also heavily practiced in Spain, England, France, Germany, a lot of those territories. The Protestant Reformation is the breaking apart of this part of Christianity, so Roman Catholicism. And essentially what occurs as a result of the Protestant Reformation is a group of Christians break away, calling themselves Protestants. So you go from having in Western Europe essentially one major church, and that is the Roman Catholic Church, right? One church, essentially into two churches now, right? And that's what the Protestant Reformation is all about. Let's go ahead and fill in some of this outline here. So Protestant Reformation, we'll say the breaking apart of the Roman Catholic Church into two groups, right? One being Catholics, and these are the same old Catholics that had always belonged to this denomination of Christianity ever since the year 1100, and two, a group that we call Protestants, right? A group that we call the Protestants. So why did this breakup happen? And this breakup here, the Protestant Reformation, we're talking approximately, we'll say 1517 CE is the specific year as to when that breakup occurred. Now, why did the Christian church break up into two pieces? Well, there are a couple reasons. First of all, the Pope at the time, Pope Leo X, was taking advantage, and the church took advantage of the increased amount of wealth. Again, let's tie it back to one of our themes here going on in the bigger picture. Used the wealth that was being generated from the increased trade to build very impressive structures to represent the power and authority of the church. One of them was St. Peter's Basilica, right? So this was a very, we'll say, big architectural. Actually, let's go ahead and see how we spell architecture. Architec, so far so good. Big architectural achievement. And it really demonstrated the wealth and power of the Catholic Church. This was occurring at a time in Italy known as the Renaissance. So the Renaissance stands for a rebirth. The Renaissance occurred anywhere between, 1200 to about 1500, and it occurred primarily in Italy. And what the rebirth represented was the refounding of a lot of Greek knowledge. So all during the Dark Ages, information about the ancient Greeks, information about, critical thinkers like Aristotle and Plato, Socrates, that was lost for a very long time. It was discovered in the late Middle Ages, and this led to kind of a re-flourishing of learning and knowledge that spread throughout the entire European continent. So you couple this rebirth or rediscovery of Greek knowledge with the increased amount of wealth that is pouring into Europe, and you get the Renaissance, and you get massive structures like St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Leo X also was very fond of selling indulgences. An indulgence was something the church sold, so we might say, an item sold by the church to reserve a spot in heaven. So the idea was that if you had sinned, you can make amends by purchasing an indulgence from the church that would essentially guarantee you a spot in heaven. Now, a lot of the things that were going on with the Catholic Church at the time were not popular amongst everyone. Martin Luther is the main figure here to start off the Protestant Reformation. This is Luther right here. He was a German, and he criticized a lot of what the church was doing. He said that the, sort of the wealth and the extravagance of the church. So you look at St. Peter's Basilica. He said, that's not in line with the Bible. Jesus doesn't talk about wealth and impressive structures. Luther, so maybe we'll cross it out. Luther also criticized the sale of indulgences and said that, this is not really morally acceptable within the Bible. This is just a greedy, corrupt way for the church to gain more money, amongst other things, right? So Luther had a lot of criticisms of what the Catholic Church was doing at the time: corruption, greed, the fact that the clergy was not practicing what they preached. Catholic clergy were supposed to be celibate. There were many instances in which they weren't. Luther also didn't like that the church only provided sermons in the Latin language, which could not be understood by most people, but could only be understood by the hierarchy. And so Luther actually sets out to reform the church. He wants to make the church better. And that's a good way of thinking about the Reformation, because within this term, Reformation is the word reform. So Luther wants to reform the church. A couple of his ideas include the idea of salvation. Salvation means, how does one get to heaven? Luther said that salvation can be achieved by faith alone. In other words, you didn't need to participate in many of the ceremonies that Catholics did at the time. And more importantly, you didn't need the clergy. You didn't have to rely on a priest. You didn't have to rely on a cardinal. Instead, all one needed to go to heaven was a Bible, faith, and individual salvation. Most importantly, Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Pope, right? He challenged the authority. In other words, he did not recognize the Pope as leader of the church. And that really is kind of the easiest way to tell the difference between who's a Catholic and who's a Protestant. So Roman Catholics are those who recognize the Pope. Protestants are those who do not recognize the Pope. Now, Luther's ideas and his criticisms of the church spread throughout Europe very rapidly, thanks to the printing press, which was a technology that made written material more widely available. Before the printing press, the only way to author a work was to do it entirely by hand. The printing press allowed for one to make multiple copies of whatever it was. In most cases, it was a Bible. In this case, it was Luther's ideas. And so because of the printing press, this really helped spread the Protestant Reformation. Right, helped spread the Protestant Reformation. So Luther is probably the individual most responsible for this breakup. Another very important Reformation contributor was John Calvin. So he is also a Protestant. And he agreed with many of Luther's ideas, but went even further. The most important thing that John Calvin put forward was this idea of predestination. Predestination is the idea that one is predestined to heaven or hell before birth. In other words, there was really nothing that one could do in order to determine if one was going to heaven or hell based off one's actions, but instead God had predestined certain individuals to go to heaven and predestined certain individuals to go to hell. John Calvin's ideas would eventually become very influential to a group of early American settlers, and that was the Puritans. The Puritans adopted some of Calvin's ideas. Now, the church, for their part, responded to the Reformation through the Counter-Reformation. So the Counter-Reformation is the Catholics, or the Catholic Church's response to Luther and Protestants. They met at the Council of Trent, or the Meeting of Trent, Among other things that the Catholic Church did was to reaffirm the authority of the Pope. And for the most part, denounced Martin Luther, excommunicated him, and considered his ideas to be very hostile and dangerous. However, the Catholic Church also realized that some of the criticisms were perhaps valid. One especially was the fact that many in the clergy were not practicing what they preached. And so as a result of this, the Counter-Reformation helped create the Society of Jesus. So the Society of Jesus and Jesuits. Jesuits are members of the society. And what the Society of Jesus was designed to do was to create Jesuits who would be model citizens for the Catholic Church, right? So these were model citizens of the Catholic Church. And it was kind of like a lead by example. Jesuits were incredibly educated. They were incredibly disciplined. So, if they were supposed to be celibate, they actually practiced celibacy. And they were dedicated to spreading the word of God. Recall that as a result of the Reformation, a lot of Europe's breaking away. The number of people in the Catholic Church it's decreasing significantly. And so the Jesuits go out pretty much to everywhere and anywhere looking for more members to replenish membership to the Catholic Church. In chapter 16, we had mentioned a little bit about how Catholic missionaries arrived in the Americas looking for converts, and also Africa looking for converts. Jesuits go out to all different parts of the world, including India, Asia, Southeast Asia, more or less wherever it is, you can count on a Jesuit being there. That was in part due to the Counter-Reformation. Probably the most significant aspect of the Protestant Reformation are the wars of religion that are sparked off as a result. These two groups, Catholics and Protestants, for approximately 150 years, so we'll go 1517 to 1648, wars of religion absolutely ravaged Europe. These wars of religion were pretty simple. It was Protestants. Protestants versus Catholics. What's going on here? And for 150 years in Europe, Protestants killed Catholics and Catholics killed Protestants. Charles V and Philip II, these are kings of Spain, really defended Catholicism. Spain was the Spain was the most powerful Catholic nation. They had become incredibly wealthy because of the riches of the New World, and they really did the dirty work for the Pope. So wherever a Protestant challenge arose, Spain sent an army in order to crush the Protestant revolt. Two examples include the Spanish Armada, 1588. A massive Spanish fleet was sent to England to crush their Protestant movement. And similarly, Dutch independence, which occurred really intermittently throughout the 1500s and 1600s, the Dutch were also primarily Protestant. So this is the country of Netherlands. It was Protestant. And they were fighting for their independence from Spain, which is primarily a Catholic nation. So even though there was a nationalist aspect to it, it was independence for the Dutch people from the Spanish crown. A lot of it also had to do with religion too. In both cases, the Spanish lost. The Spanish Armada was sunk by the English fleet, and even though this war for independence by the Netherlands took a very long time, ultimately the Dutch did become an independent nation. So much of that wealth and money that was being extracted from the New World, for Spain anyways, went right back into the wars of religion. In other areas, in France, for example, the wars of religion had a much more domestic consequence, I would say. It divided the French country into two camps, Protestants and Catholics. In France, it was a civil war. In France, the war was so brutal that the King of France eventually issued the Edict of Nantes, which is a very important thing to come out of the wars of religion. The Edict of Nantes essentially allowed for religious toleration. You know, these wars of religion were so deadly and so damaging that monarchs and even some religious leaders realized that perhaps it wasn't worth killing each other for religious differences, and instead one should tolerate other people's religion. This was a very slow process, a slow and bloody process to get to for most European monarchs. The Edict of Nantes is important because it's one of the first of this kind. However, even this edict didn't last very long, as it was later repealed by the French Catholic monarch. So in France, the monarch or the king is Catholic, but many of the nobles, the nobility, not all of them, but some of them could be Protestants. They, really liked Luther's ideas. In fact, there's a particular word or term to describe a French Protestant, and that is a Huguenot. Let's see, Huguenot, right? So Huguenot is a French Protestant. In England, the Reformation took a slightly different turn. Recall that a lot of princes and kings and rulers are breaking away from the Catholic Church, so perhaps it was a little bit trendy. King Henry VIII, King of England, wanted an annulment. An annulment is essentially a divorce. King Henry VIII of England wanted a divorce from his wife because she couldn't produce a male heir. Only the Pope could do that, and the Pope refused. And so what Henry VIII decided to do, rather, was instead of waiting for papal authority, he would break away and create his own church, the Anglican Church or the Church of England. Instead of the Pope being at the head of the church, it would be the king who would be in charge. And so Henry VIII made himself the head of his own church. Because the Church of England and because Anglicans do not recognize the Pope, we consider them to be Protestants, right? We'd consider them to be Protestants. So you can see from this map here, essentially, I'm not sure how well you can actually see it, but this gives you kind of a breakdown of how Europe became fragmented as a result of the wars of religion. So first of all, we have in the yellow here, actually let me go ahead and get this. We would call this mostly Lutherans, right? So this is those who follow Martin Luther. His home country of Germany is pretty well represented. So maybe let's go ahead and Lutherans. In the, what is this, pink here, right? Those are Calvinists, or people who follow John Calvin. So you can see that there's some kind of areas in here, but for the most part, Scotland and the Netherlands, so Calvinists. And then in the orange are the Anglicans. That is the Church of England, Anglican. So all of these categories fall under category Protestants. Lutherans are Protestants, Calvinists are Protestants, Anglicans are Protestants. On the other side, we have in the blue, and you can see this is mostly well represented here. This is the Catholic Church that still officially recognizes the Pope as being in charge. And there's a lot of territory here. Rome being located right here. That is the center of Catholicism, and Spain here. And so the wars of religion, in the way that they were conducted, was usually Spain, because Spain was the most powerful Catholic nation, sending the Spanish Armada to attack England, trying to suppress the Dutch Protestant revolt, sending armies into Germany, which witnessed German princes and German counts and barons battling one another, Protestants and Catholics, etc., etc. The other ones to make note of, so let me go ahead and, so Catholic is blue. The purple is the Orthodox Church, right? And again, recall that we had mentioned the Orthodox Church right here. It's not part of the Protestant Reformation because the Orthodox Church broke away 400 years before our book begins. We're not as concerned there. And one more group that we can mark in terms of their religion is the green, and that is the Islamic world, or where Muslims reside, primarily the Ottoman Empire. So we'll say Islam. And that more or less is the way in which Europe becomes religiously fragmented. All these Protestant areas that were marked, recall that before the Protestant Reformation, these were blue, right? That was blue, that was blue, blue, blue. That was the cultural unity that was, that I'd mentioned earlier. So 150 years of religious warfare characterized the European continent after the Protestant Reformation. On a much more local level, the Protestant Reformation also had some pretty significant consequences, culminating in some pretty radical movements, or events, I should say, and that is witch hunts. Now, witch hunts in Europe, and you can see an illustration of a witch hunt here, were especially popular from, the 15 to about late 1500s, so maybe 1550, till about 1700. By the time 1700, they really die out. And so you can see how witch hunts increased with the Protestant Reformation because it just created kind of more religious tension, you might say. Now, witch hunts were a combination of two things. On the one hand, it was old local traditions, the belief in magic and spirits. So these were pre-Christian ideas, right, and pre-Christian culture. Europeans believed in magical spells. They believed in spirits. This was already well established before Christianity. What Christianity introduced was miracles and specifically the devil, and witch hunts were often very closely tied to the idea of the devil either possessing someone, instructing someone to do something, or agents of the devil here on earth. So this was what Christianity contributed. And so in local towns and small towns across Europe, whenever there was a harvest that was bad, whenever there was bad weather, if some members of the village fell sick, a lot of times it was blamed on witches, and witches were killed in mass as a result of this. 100,000 witches were executed during the witch hunts. Even special courts were set up to interrogate and figure out if people had been possessed by Satan or possessed by Satan's agents. The Inquisition was a church court designed to investigate heresy, right? And heresy is witchcraft, etc., etc. A lot of different nations and rulers had some sort of church court, some sort of inquisition. The most famous one, of course, being that of Spain, right? The Spanish Inquisition. Oftentimes, religious minorities were targeted. Oftentimes, women were targeted, especially widowed women. And by about the 1700s, these sort of witch hunts more or less fell out of favor. Now, that's all going on in the culture front, right? Going on in the culture and religious front. But also there are some very important changes that take place in terms of ideas. The first one being the scientific revolution. And the scientific revolution is a movement to understand the world differently. And a major contributing factor to the scientific revolution was the discovery of the New World. So if we go back to this map up here, recall that, prior to 1492, the world was only this part right here. And as a result of Columbus's voyage, this entirety, part of the globe was discovered by Europeans in particular. And what that made a lot of people do was to think about the way that knowledge was understood. Think about it this way. If one believes something, and this was believed, pretty much since recorded knowledge in Europe, that the earth was one way, and then suddenly overnight, one realizes that the earth is another way, it causes people to think that, what else do we know that could be different, right? We're so certain about the globe, it turns out we were wrong all along. What else are we not understanding about the world around us? And this really helped to kind of put a jolt in the scientific revolution, where people began to question long-standing assumptions. Right? What else do we not know? Now, knowledge up until the 1500s, really, in Europe, was based in two things: antiquity and the Bible. The Bible is pretty straightforward. That is, Christianity. Antiquity simply just refers to the time period of the ancient Greeks. And this goes back to this Renaissance, right? Or rebirth, which was the discovery. I'll maybe make it a different color here. The rediscovery of Greek knowledge. And this occurred in the late Middle Ages, where the works of people like Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, pre-Christian knowledge, was being discovered. And so they took, or especially intellectuals, took from the ideas of the ancient Greeks, especially Aristotle, and Aristotle more or less provided, combined with the Bible, the basis for knowledge in Europe. One example in which Aristotle influenced understanding about the world was that he said that the earth was the center of the universe. Right, he said the earth was the center of the universe. Well, now it's time, after discovering the New World, to start questioning some long-standing assumptions. One of the first people to do this was Nicholas Copernicus. He was, we'll call him a scientist, although they didn't use that actual term at the time. But Nicholas Copernicus put forward the idea of a heliocentric universe, that is, a sun-centered universe, challenging the long-standing assumption that Aristotle said it was the Earth at the center of the universe. Johannes Kepler stated that planets revolve in an oval pattern. Aristotle had stated that no, it was circular. Johannes Kepler said no, it's actually, if you look at it, it's more in an oval pattern. Galileo invented this telescope, which would also help him to observe the planets and moon. And what all of these things had in common was it said, look, in order to understand or better understand the world, it's not a matter of relying only on thinkers like Aristotle or antiquity. And in fact, it's not even through the Bible. The best way to understand the world, rather, is through observation, right? Observation and logic. And that's what all these thinkers potentially had in common. Now, these ideas were threatening. In fact, Galileo was put on trial by the Catholic Church. This is a picture of his trial, and forced to recant what he said, because sometimes these observations would go against what the Bible taught and would therefore be viewed by the church as a threat to church authority. Just like with the Protestant Reformation, printed books were incredibly important in spreading, but also building upon scientific thoughts. Really, one of the reasons why the scientific revolution flourished was because, Nicholas Copernicus wrote down his theory about a heliocentric universe, and so Kepler could borrow Copernicus's theory. Galileo could read about what Kepler discovered, and this accumulation of knowledge that could build off itself was incredibly important in leading to the scientific discoveries that were made in this particular period. Specific organizations and institutions, so organization to promote science, were created, right? And this, of course, also helped institutionalize it, keep track of records, help the scientific revolution flourish. The most important and significant thinker of the scientific revolution by far was Isaac Newton, and that was his discovery of universal laws, which stated, there are a couple of different laws that Newton put forward. A lot of them have to do with physics. He was also a contributor to many of the ideas related in calculus, but this idea of universal laws said that certain laws of the universe applied everywhere and really at every time. And this, Isaac Newton's theory, for example, gravity, right? What goes up must come down. According to Isaac Newton, this is true anywhere, at any time, at any place. This, of course, contradicted the church's notion of things like miracles or the popular notion of magic. So there was hostility to some of these ideas, hostility from the church, and popular. Right? Very important idea, this idea of universal laws, more or less, was the basis for our understanding about things like physics and the world around us, all the way up until the period of Albert Einstein in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. So these ideas being very, very important by Newton, universal laws. One last significant change in the ways that Europeans thought was the Enlightenment. Rather than looking at the world around them, Enlightenment thinkers looked at things like the economy, politics, and society, and questioned long-standing assumptions about those things. So, for example, what the Enlightenment thinkers really challenged was, is the best government system an absolute monarch? Is the best social system one based off nobility and bloodlines? That's really the way that European politics and society was organized at that time. So these Enlightenment thinkers began challenging notions about the monarchy, challenging notions about privilege and bloodlines and nobility. The most famous thinker was Voltaire, who was an advocate of free speech. Voltaire, that wasn't his real name. He had to change his name because when Enlightenment thinkers published works criticizing the monarch, criticizing the church, they were oftentimes persecuted, and so Voltaire was a pen name to hide his true identity. These ideas were very dangerous to the people in power at the time, monarchs, nobles, and the church, who more or less ruled everything. He advocated free speech, things like religious toleration was a big one, against superstition. The impact that the wars of religion had on Enlightenment thinkers was huge. You have to recall that for 150 years, there was bloodshed and destruction simply over different ideas, different religious beliefs. Enlightenment thinkers, it's difficult to put them all in one category because they have different variations of what they believe. For the most part, they agree that monarchy is probably not the best form of government, although not all agree on that. They agree that bloodlines or basing one's status on your birth probably isn't the best idea. Many of them do challenge the authority of the Pope, but not all. But one thing they all have in common is this idea of faith in progress, and that is the belief that human society can be improved, right? That people have the power to improve society, that one is not just kind of up to the mercy of God or anything else like that, and that society should be improved. And just like the other ideas, like the Protestant Reformation, like the scientific revolution, an instrumental process of spreading Enlightenment thought was the printing press, right? So this spread ideas far and wide, so that in the within the 200 years or so of the Enlightenment movement, these ideas are well known far and wide.